Okay, so this is an important book. A lot of people are going to be wondering
Yeah.
why.
Yeah.
Uh, can you explain why a theory of justice is a really historic intellectual achievement that'll be read 200 years from now?
Um, well, I can try and you can judge whether I'm successful or not.
Okay.
And
I am
I
not,
do
I
think,
want people to know I'm not pretending to be a political philosopher
no, no,
here, but
no.
Josh and I have been friends for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I
And
know
we've,
this is right at his heart. This is the core of the man. So I want to
yeah.
give him a chance to express
Yeah.
himself.
Um, and just as preface, I should say, I do think it'll continue to be read for a very long time. And I don't think that's, it's hard to think of. I mean, in contrast, and I don't mean this as an invidious
Mm-hmm.
contrast. I mean, Ronald Dworkin was a brilliant legal and political thinker and incredibly influential. Um, but I don't think Dworkin and wrote a vast amount, and it's terrific in all sorts of ways. But I don't think people are going to be reading Dworkin in not in the way that they'll be reading Rawls in, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. So there's something unusual about it. I mean, one way to think about it, Glenn, is so here's one angle. There are a few others that we can explore, but here's one angle. If you think just sort of stylizing some, put yourself in the 1950s as John Rawls is writing this book, or the 60s, or it could be the 30s or 40s, and sometime in the 20th century, and you think, what are the large options, so to speak, in political philosophy, large directions of thought? And I don't think it's stylizing too much to say there's a kind of the classical liberal tradition, which is very powerfully expressed, say, in Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, Road to Serfdom, a more, very important popular work, but the classical liberalism in which the value of liberty is fundamental. I don't think it's helpful to think of this as libertarianism in some, overlay. It's, classical liberalism. The value of liberty is fundamental. And there's the perception that there is, and the claim that there's a fundamental tension between emphasizing the value of liberty and putting any weight on the value of equality. And, this is, if Friedman says in Capitalism and Freedom, and I think of that as, another great text of classical liberalism, Friedman says, well, you can be a liberal or you can be an egalitarian. You cannot be both. That's pretty close to a quotation. And I think it's on page 195 of the edition that I have of Capitalism and Freedom. But if anybody's interested, I can find it for you. So that's one kind of view. And then, again, stylizing some, what they're thinking is, well, there are these egalitarians, and maybe, they're thinking of Marx as as an egalitarian. People give according to their ability and receive according to their needs, and critique of exploitation. And so you can be an egalitarian or you can be a classical liberal, but you can't be both. Now, of course, it's true as a practical matter that when you look at the evolution of social democracy and social democratic welfare states over the course of the 20th century, the practice is to try to be both. And critics of those political economies from the classical liberal position are always saying, well, they're about the concern about equality is about to swallow up the commitment to liberty. And that's what Hayek says in Road to Serfdom. He worries about that. And then critics from the left say, the commitment to equality is somehow, unstable because you still have basically a private property regime, and et cetera. So Rawls comes along, and what Rawls says is that what he's aiming to do in his theory of justice, and this is pretty close to a quote, is to achieve what he calls a reconciliation between liberty and equality. That is, to produce a political philosophy that is not founded on the idea that you've got a choice between these fundamental political values, but that there's a way of accommodating both of them in a coherent set of political philosophical principles. And I don't think, and if somebody says other people did this before, John Stuart Mill sort of did it, but in a utilitarian framework. I mean, there's John Stuart Mill, who is the author of On Liberty, and also self-described socialist. So Mill did, but again, it's the middle of the 19th century, and it's in a utilitarian framework. So Rawls, that's a way to think about what he was aspiring to do, and the commitment to the value of equality comes out in a whole bunch of different ways in his view, including the ways that he thinks about democracy and the importance of fair political equality as part of his first principle of justice, his idea of fair equality of opportunity, that people who are equally able and equally talented should have equal chances, not just legal equality of opportunity, but the substantive equality of opportunity, and in his difference principle, that inequalities are only justified if they work to the maximum benefit of the least advantaged. Not the middle class, by the way, but the least advantaged, meaning roughly people who are in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. And the commitment to liberty is there as well. His first principle has a principle of equal basic liberties, has priority in his system. So, one of the ways that he puts this, when he says that he's aiming to achieve a reconciliation of liberty and equality, he has an idea that he calls the worth of liberty. And the idea is you've got your liberties, they're protected as a matter of law, some basic liberties. But how much of the liberties, what's the value of the liberties to you? Well, that kind of depends on what you can do with them. Not exclusively, but to some extent, it depends on what you can do with them. At first approximation, what you can do with your liberties depends on the income and wealth that you've got. The spirit becomes flesh. You can do stuff with the liberties that you've got. So then he says, so if you think that the worth of liberty, not just having the liberty, but the worth of liberty is a function, in fact, a monotone increasing function of the wealth and income that you've got at your disposal, then suppose you start there. Then you say, okay, he has these two principles of justice. Everybody's entitled to equal basic liberties. And then part of his second principle, the difference principle, says inequalities have to work to the maximum benefit of the least advantaged. So imagine that you got both those principles satisfied. Well, what that means is if you've maximized for the least advantaged, then what you've done is not only maximize the income expectation, you've maximized the worth of liberty to the least advantaged. And that's what Rawls says is what he calls the end of social justice. The end of social justice is to maximize the worth to the least advantaged of, as he puts it, the equal scheme of liberties shared by all. That's a long-winded answer to your question.
I've got a couple of questions.
But go ahead. Yeah, please.
Okay, so one of these is the simple-minded observation that in order to expand the ability of the least advantaged to realize the potentiality of liberty, you have to take my property. I'm a successful person. You have to tax me. You have to, under threat of coercion, confiscate my wealth.
Yeah.
How is that not an infringement upon my liberty? And where do you get off doing that? I mean, what is the justification for the
Great.
infringement upon my prerogatives on behalf of this project?
Yeah.
The other question is, why the least advantage? Why is the least advantage normatively trumping everything here? But I want you to address the first question first.
Well, they're both great questions, and we'll take them in turn. So the first question is, why isn't the kind of tax transfer scheme? I mean, that's how Rawls is thinking about it. You have a tax transfer scheme that enacts the difference principle. And by the way, you talked earlier about the enthusiasm of people in economics. They were very interested in this. And Nick Stern, Sir Nicholas Stern of the Stern Report, the Stern Review, Climate, wrote a paper in 1975 trying to figure out what the tax rates would need to be in order to satisfy the difference principle. And one of the things that and I'm going to get around to, I'm not evading your question. I'm giving an excessively thorough answer to your very good question, but there's a relevant point. So Rawls' second principle has an opportunity part and a kind of an outcomes part. The opportunity part, as I mentioned, is this idea of fair equality of opportunity, that people who are equally able and equally motivated should have equal chances and not have differential chances in virtue of irrelevant facts like the social class that they're born into, or racial differences or gender differences. And the idea, this was a principle that that fair equality of opportunity principle would require, in order to satisfy it, it would require a wide dispersion of property and also a significant investment in education and training, in human capital, so to speak. And what Stern pointed out was that what the tax transfer rates would need to be in order to meet the requirements of the difference principle depended in part on how successful you were in meeting the opportunity principle at reducing the skew in the distribution of skill, and thus in reducing the skew in the distribution of market income. And the more you reduce the distribution the more you reduce the skew in the distribution of skill, thus reduce the skew in the distribution of market income, the lower the difference principle tax rates had to be. I mean, I think it's sort of intuitive, but he worked out the details.
Let me see if I can translate this to layman's. I think there are two spheres in which the egalitarian project can be pursued on Stern's analysis. One of them is at the point where people acquire their human capital and their earnings potential. The other is at the point where they realize their earnings potential.
Correct.
You can equalize the distribution of skill, and that means you'd have to do less of redistribution of income. And there's going to be a trade-off between those things, and the economist equations can tell you, just where that margin is realized.
Thank you. I don't know if that was in layman's terms, Glenn. It did have the advantage of being shorter than mine. But yes, exactly right. Exactly right. So it's like a model of earnings in which you ask how much, if you have unequal earnings, how much of that is due to inequalities in human capital and how much of it is due to labor market discrimination, say, or something.
Let me just make an observation here about liberty, though. We still have to talk about why is it the least advantage that we're concerned. Yeah. But if you play out this idea that Nick Stern suggests, and you think carefully about the acquisition of skill, you realize that some of that work gets done in the sphere of informal social life within the family to equalize
yeah,
access to the
yeah,
acquisition of skills.
yeah,
Seriously,
yeah,
means equalizing the experiences that youngsters have in their most formative years, which takes place in this private sphere
yeah,
of family association. Now, that seems to me to be an infringement upon liberty.
yeah,
The well-educated and prosperous
yeah,
parents can't have a special school for their kids and
yeah.
can't give their kids every benefit of the human capital that they could transfer within the family, lest we end up with wide disparity in the preparation of people for earning incomes, which is inegalitarian. So I don't know what Rawls might have to say about that, but I wonder what you have to say about the conflict between the liberty of association and family life on the one hand and the imperative of giving people an equal opportunity to realize their human potential on the other.
I think I probably have kind of this, and we're going to get to the liberty, to the infringement, the other infringement, the original infringement of liberty point that you made in a second. This is all kind of warm up to that. I think the hope, and maybe it's a pious hope anyway, but it's at least an old hope, is that you can, if the point of a system of fair equality of opportunity is that birth is not fate, the genesis is not destiny, that where you start out doesn't fix where you end up, and that's an important idea, then that's a rationale for investing a lot in education and training. And that's the hope, is that you can get that kind of, while preserving the virtues, the beauty of parents reading to their children, et cetera, that you can nevertheless do that in a way that's consistent with a system of strong equality of opportunity if you're serious about investing in schools as, Horace Mann's great equalizer. Now, we know Horace Mann was not entirely right about education being the great equalizer, but we also know that that the seriousness of investing in that the investments in education and training that would be required, as well as in the dispersion of property, but the investments in education and training that would be required to get some kind of equality of chances, they haven't really been made very seriously. So in this country, maybe in other places, yes, more, but they haven't been made seriously. But let's go back to the simple answer to the simple, and I don't say that this is I emphasize simple, the short answer to your question about why isn't this a fundamental infringement of liberty, is that Rawls accepts what is, essentially the constitutional consensus in the United States after 1937, which is the date of the Supreme Court decision, West Coast Hotel v. Parrish, which basically constitutionalizes the New Deal and overturns the earlier 20th century Lochner era in which market liberties had a kind of constitutional prominence and arguably preeminence. And the idea is that there's a fundamental difference. It's also a kind of Brandeisian idea that there's a fundamental difference between the liberties that are associated with democracy, say freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedoms associated with political participation, religious liberty. There's a fundamental difference between those liberties and the economic liberties, that is, the liberties associated with market interactions, and that the standards for regulating the latter, that is, the market liberties, are much looser than the standards for regulating the former, that is, the fundamental liberties, religious liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of association, liberties associated with political participation, integrity of the person. So the market liberties, that is, the liberties associated with ownership of property and exchanging on the terms that you judge to be appropriate, don't have the same kind of prominence in the liberty firmament that the democratic and religious liberties have. Now there's a further question, which is what accounts for the difference, and we can talk about that. But here's the way Rawls is thinking about this is that what his first principle protects is not, as he would put it, liberty as such. That is, it's not a uniform high-level protection of equally high-level protection provided for all.
Excuse me.
Bless you. Provided for all. Bless you.
Thank you.
Not a uniform high level of protection provided for all choices. There are certain what he calls basic or fundamental liberties, and the ones that I mentioned before. So you can't regulate religious liberty in order to improve the circumstances of the least advantaged. You can't regulate democratic. You can't say no voting rights for the rich because what we want to do, right? But market liberties are a different matter.